For our next session, Preparing the Body and Mind, please welcome Kris Lehnhardt, an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at George Washington University, Sheyna Gifford, a participant in the NASA-funded High Seas 4 mission, and Michael Lopez-Alegria, a former NASA astronaut. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome back Alison Stewart.
Oh, thank you, a gentleman, an astronaut and gentleman. We've talked about the technology, we've talked about the politics, we've talked about the funding. Now we really should talk about the people who are going to have to do this and what they're going to have to endure and how they're going to have to train. And everybody here has a really interesting perspective on it. So what I want to do is ask a couple individual questions and then have you all dive in. And feel free to answer if you hear something that sparks something in your mind. Sheyna, let's start with you. High seas is on a volcano in Hawaii, Mauna Loa, and it is designed to simulate what it might be like for the people, the crew that will ultimately wind up on Mars. So explain a little bit what your role was, what your everyday activities were like, and how that will inform what happens in 15 years. We'll go with 15 years.
All right. First question, although I'll make a comment, even though the base is on the volcano, there are no evil geniuses involved. My role was the crew physician and the crew journalist. And yes, I play both sides perfectly comfortably. What we were there to do was mostly to look at the psychological aspects of a Mars mission. So up there at 8,200 feet in this 1,200 square foot geodesic dome, it looks to a certain extent like Mars, but you are still on Earth. So you're not testing differences in gravity and air pressure. You are testing differences in communication. You have a 20-minute delay each direction back to Earth in all of your communication. So it's an awfully long Skype call. Then you've got the interactions between the crew themselves. What is it like for 6 people to live in 1,200 square feet for an entire year? So what does it do to their bodies? What does it do to their minds? So we were basically there as a trial run, just like they did for Apollo, just like they did for Skylab, just like they did for the International Space Station. You test, you learn, and then you go for real.
So what was the biggest hurdle physically for you over the course of the year, and then psychologically?
The biggest hurdle physically for me, you know, I went to medical school, so being locked in a small place with smart people really wasn't that shocking. I think for me as a physician, I was concerned that somebody would get injured. And you know, people talk, well, you're really on Earth, so it's not that dangerous. Being at the top of a mountain is relatively perilous. And I did not have blood to give, or fluid. I mean, I had some fluids, but not much. I had basically no pain medication. So I really was concerned that in transiting the lava fields and going down into caves, there'd be a cave collapse or someone would have a terrible fall. So physically, I was concerned about my crew. Psychologically, I was concerned about my crew. That was my biggest holdup, really. I'd been on a previous mission for NASA, and as the people here can tell you, you get into a mode of being just very calm under stress, so that really wasn't an issue. I was mostly just concerned about what might happen to the people for whom I was responsible.
Michael, you went through this in real life, in real space. We talked a little bit backstage about something that you feel needs to be explored a little bit more, especially when we're talking about the amount of time that these men and women will be spending. The psychological effects. What do you think needs to be considered when they go through the training? What are something that you experienced or some observation you've made or some feeling you have that really needs to be addressed?
Well, when I'm asked about how hard was it to spend 7 months up there without contact with your friends and family, the fact is it's not hard at all because you are in contact with your friends and family. So we had, of course, email. We had a telephone that we could literally pick up at that time almost any time, and now certainly the vast majority of the orbit, and call home. Call anybody, call any number on the planet, and then, you know, play games about who's calling, please? The point is, we had very good communication infrastructure that allowed us to have that those conversations. And as you heard before from Dr. Stofan, and I think Mary Lynn said it also, you know, 40-minute round trip, hello, what? And it's going to take a long time. So that's one aspect. The other thing is looking out at the planet is incredibly soothing. So we have this wonderful cupola that we can stick our noses up against. And that is by far the spare time #1 thing to do, is just look at the Earth go by. It's incredibly beautiful. And people on their way to Mars are not going to be able to do that. I mean, it's going to be daytime all the time. At some point, they're going to, if they can even look back toward Earth, they won't be able to tell which one of those dots is Earth. And I think that feeling is very, very different from anything we've experienced. So I think those considerations, in addition to all the other things that you've heard about all day, radiation, eclipse, the food supply, all those things are very important.
What kind of psychological prep do you do for a mission like you were on?
When we transitioned from flying the shuttle, which were roughly 1 week to 2 week missions, to long duration flights, which began with the Shuttle Mir program in the mid-90s, we quickly realized that this is a different game. And we started developing almost a syllabus to prepare astronauts for what we call expedition behavior. So we start out with some lectures. It was actually fairly theoretical. And then we had a series of field exercises, the goal of which was to put you in an uncomfortable, physiologically uncomfortable environment. So well, first of all, you're always hungry. Sometimes you're thirsty because you don't have water. Sometimes you're cold, sometimes you're hot, but you're just not, you've got less margin to deal with. And those stressors add up, and almost everybody at some point sort of goes over the edge. And then you take a pause and you think about, what are the coping mechanisms that I can learn, and how am I going to deal with that if it happens to me on orbit? And then our sort of graduate exercise is something called NEMO, NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, which is an underwater habitat off the coast of Florida. And we spend several weeks in isolation in there with a crew of 4. It's very much like being on orbit, because you're in saturation, so you can't, if you're out doing an EVA, which in that case is a dive, you can't just say, I'm tired of this, and go up to the surface, or you'll have serious, you'll die. I mean, you may not die, but you'll be in rough shape. So that is sort of the culmination. And people experience different kinds of, or different levels, I would say, of success in those things, and that helps in the selection process and deciding who needs further training.
Sheyna, I saw you nod when the word stressor came up. Why did you do that?
Because the stressors occur both naturally and, as Michael was just describing, some of them are pre-scripted. So when I was on our asteroid mission, and you're right, after Earth and the moon are the size of your thumb and then they fade away into the star field, it's a little bit weird. Your connection to Earth is just sort of not there. And the people over the radio can talk to you continuously, and then only every 5 minutes, and then only every 10 minutes. And so it's just you and your crew. Forever, it seems, and that's the way it feels. I didn't find that very stressful. I actually did find that kind of interesting and soothing, and then bizarre when we came back and Earth is enormous again. Mm-hmm. But the stressors of not being able to pick up that phone and talk to your family are real, and they're profound. And we had family things go on. My crewmate Cyprian was on the mission when there was the attack in Nice, and he found out about it during dinner. And Mission Control had to call us and say, we're so sorry, we have to tell you about this. And he sat there in front of his computer willing it to fork over information about his friends and family. I think he sat there all night, frankly, because it was nighttime in Europe by that point. My grandmother died while I was on mission. I said goodbye to her over delayed video. And that's not something you ever want to do, but it's something you do, and life goes on. And that morning I got up and I did my job. And so those stressors are real, not pre-scripted. And then there are these scripted stressors that we go through in preparation. So the stress is real, but it's doable, it's workable.
Kris, I want to bring you into the conversation to talk about the physical stresses. When I was Googling around and researching and reading, of course, something popped up, a listicle, 5 ways Mars can kill you. We've been through most of them, I think, during the course of this afternoon. Radiation, obviously, being the most serious, or at least from a layman's person, radiation seems to be the most serious. What do you think is the most serious?
I think that radiation is a good place to start. You've heard some of our panelists and people speaking today about how we know a reasonable amount now about what the radiation exposure is like en route to Mars. And that's thanks to the instrument that was placed on the Curiosity. What we don't know is how space radiation affects human bodies. So the study of radiobiology is the interaction of radiation with biological material. And the number of people who have been exposed to space radiation, truly exposed to space radiation in a fairly quantifiable level, the folks on the International Space Station are somewhat protected by being close to Earth and close to the sun. So the idea that we need to go with biological tissue out beyond the International Space Station, to the moon, beyond the moon, and actually see what happens to biological material, whether it's human or otherwise, is important information. We try to do it on Earth, but we can't really do it very well. We can simulate some space radiation on Earth in some laboratories, and some of the studies that have done that are actually kind of alarming. So if you take simulated space radiation and you expose the brain of a rodent to that radiation, that rodent's not very smart anymore and can't go through the maze. And we don't know if that's going to happen to people. You don't want to be 7 months on the way to Mars and realize that you don't know what switch to throw because you don't know what checklist to look at because you can't remember your training.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you teach about is adaptability, that the human body is amazing at adapting. Is that a pro or a con when we're talking about Mars?
It has to be a pro. We could never go to Mars unless we were able to adapt to our environment. So we are the dominant species on this planet because we adapt. We adapt really well physically, but then we also use our brains to adapt when we can't physically do what we need to do. And the adaptations that are required to go to Mars are going to be really profound. And you've heard about the stressors and the psychological issues. Those are going to be a big challenge. Beyond that, we have to deal with the effects of prolonged microgravity. So if you are spending 7 to 9 months flying to Mars in what is essentially zero gravity, your bones don't like that, your muscles don't like that, your heart doesn't like that. We have to find ways to overcome those issues. And exercise is what we do on the International Space Station. That's a great option, except now we're talking about a much smaller space, and we're talking about not being able to have all the equipment that we currently have on Space Station. So we're just starting to figure out how to deal with muscle and bone loss on station, and now the moment we start going further away, we're suddenly going to have to figure it out all over again because we can't take any of the stuff that we wanted to take with us because we don't have enough space to do it.
How were you physically when you came back?
I was a little tired. They say anecdotally that it takes about a day on Earth for every day you're in space, and I would say that's about right. And that's to get sort of back to 100%. Now, you recover pretty quickly. There's a few things. I mean, the first thing is your sense of orthostatic intolerance, which means that when you stand up, you feel like you're going to fall over because you're faint. And in general, that's a matter of minutes to hours before that's fixed. Then you have the issue of being able to stand up, of having a sense of balance. So I don't really know the medical terms behind it. Maybe Kris could help me. But the way I describe it to people is that when you first get to space, your eyes are telling you one thing, and your head is telling you something else. Your head, meaning the inner ear, is sort of saying there is no up and there is no down, but your eyes are saying, well, there is up because all the writing on the lockers is oriented this way, so that must be up. Turns out your ear is right, but your brain ends up believing your eyes. And when you so they disconnect those two channels. They don't talk anymore. And you start thinking about what your eyes are telling you. When you come back, it takes a long time for those things to reconnect. And until then, if you close your eyes, you just fall over because your inner ear is not that feedback channel is gone. That takes a week. For short duration flight, maybe 3 or 4 days. For long duration flight, maybe a week or 2 at the most. But the pervasive thing is sort of this sense of fatigue and weakness. I mean, obviously, things are heavier on Earth than they are in space, and I can tell you that there's literally an instance where I let a glass go because I thought it would stay there, and it didn't. So that really feels to me like it took about 6 or 7 months where I could really feel like, okay, now I'm completely back to normal. It's as if I never left.
Sheyna, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One thing I want people to understand, when Sheyna was in this environment, when you would go out, you would have to suit up It was to simulate everything. For example, if you were going to go out and do rock collection, you had to put the suits on, everything like that. Tell us what that experience was like, and did you feel freer when you were outside of the structure?
That's a great question. You know, you don't get the wind in your face or the sun on your skin for a year. Done and done, or in the case of Mars, 3 years. Do you feel freer when you're wearing 50 pounds and trying to navigate over lava? I would say not especially. The 50-pound suit that I'm referring to is the one that we've designed since coming back, but the intention right now with the Z2 suit is that it will be about 50 pounds in Martian gravity. That's a heavy, heavy suit. But you're wearing a spaceship. So there you are in your personal spaceship, roving over the lava, hoping it won't collapse under you, because this is not a known territory. And I was in a lava collapse at one point. I felt about a meter. So you feel like you're in a little bit of peril, but at least you have this unbounded horizon, rather than the 12 steps it takes to go from one end of your dome to the other. So you go from being in a 12-step wide environment to an infinite step wide environment, but now you're in a spacesuit, in a spaceship, on ground that might collapse. So it's a different environment. The perils are different. Your senses are more alive and awake. Let me tell you, the most fun part, though, is going out at night. Going out at night in a spacesuit and lying underneath the stars on top of the volcano and watching the arm of the galaxy rise is one of the most beautiful things in the world. They radio, you ready to come in? No. And as you're just lying on your side, and the only sound you hear is the fan blowing, circulating your air, and you're just watching the stars rise. That's very freeing. But otherwise, you're just acutely aware of the fact that you're in a spaceship, and right here is death.
Yeah. Kris, sound is a big issue, I've heard. Is that the sense that takes the biggest beating?
The noise in a spacecraft, Mike has lived this, it's perpetual. There is so much machinery, there's so many electronics, there's so many things happening constantly that it is a constant assault on your brain. And it takes a psychological toll on you, but it also takes a physical toll as well. And one of the big challenges is how do we control that environment to make it as quiet as possible, but it still needs to be functional. And so there are limits that are set for space travel. So on the space station, there is a general limit for how noisy it's allowed to be, and it can peak and it can go up and down at times. But your brain is constantly trying to process that signal, that noise that just won't go away, and it's very fatiguing, and it can affect your ability to do your tasks. So it affects crew performance, but it also just annoys people.
Yeah, I would actually nominate a second sense that takes a beating, and that's your vision. So for when we started doing these long duration flights, it took not very many increments before we realized that folks were coming back, some people, with pretty degraded visual acuity. I'm talking shifts of up to 2 diopters in or far-sighted shifts, so plus 2 diopters in the space of 6 months. Often it coincides with people, when they get to the age where they're presbyopic and their arms get too short, but that's a pretty dramatic shift. So, and we don't know what's going on yet. I mean, we thought we had it, they actually call it visual impairment intracranial pressure, but now intracranial pressure may not be the culprit. So this is something that's going to be an issue. And now people are flying with different degrees of prescription lenses to accommodate a potential shift as they get up there. It's pretty dramatic.
I would nominate, I guess, a fourth sense after the vestibular system and the visual system and the auditory system, and that's your olfactory system. Your sense of smell takes one heck of a beating, too. As the one who had to clean the composting toilets, I can attest to that. But your sense of smell is linked to your sense of taste. Your sense of taste is linked to your desire to eat. Your desire and ability to eat is linked to your physiological well-being, and your physiological well-being is linked to your psychological well-being. So your sense of smell actually has this profound effect on your overall ability to stay healthy and continue to do your tasks.
I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions and then take questions from the floor because we've got about 5 minutes left. Kris, I asked you backstage, what is something you think is not discussed enough when we talk about, or just doesn't get on the table when we talk about long duration space travel? And it was quite interesting what you said.
So I teach a graduate course about human health in space, and one way to get my students' attention is to tell them that we're going to talk about sex in space. But it's not meant to be salacious necessarily. It's a real concern. One thing that we say we don't know enough about biology and nutrition and all these different things in spaceflight, something we really don't know about is human reproduction in space. Not only how our reproductive systems adapt to the space environment, but if we actually want to go places and we want to stay there, if we're talking about colonization, there's a key component to colonization that makes it possible, and that is having babies. And this is something that we frankly have never studied dramatically because it's not been relevant to date. But if we want to become a spacefaring species and we want to live in space permanently, this is a crucial issue that we have to address that just has not been fully studied yet.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Who's got the mic?
John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. We have had experience over the years with Antarctica in winter for isolation, submarines for confined spaces. How are we able to build on what we learned in those environments with what we're doing now, getting ready for space?
Well, we can start with the example of the environmental control and life support systems on ISS and on any vehicle are modeled to some degree, at least from a submarine, because those are obviously closed-loop systems. Now, there's obviously water and things like that available to the submarine that are not, and we just can't reach out into the vacuum and get any of the resources. But all those things are elements that build upon one another, and I think we've learned a great deal from the precursors.
Hi, I'm Ahmadine Ahmed, and I was fascinated by Michael's comment about the tendency to become farsighted in space. I know in the past, a prerequisite for astronauts was they have perfect vision. For the Mars mission, should we consider hiring people who are nearsighted so they can come back with normal vision?
No, but I think that's an interesting point, not that one specifically, but it brings up this ethical question about what kind of screening do we do for that type of mission. As Kris was mentioning, we really don't understand the effects of radiation on tissue, and there are different effects on different organs. So you could genetically screen people who are more or less susceptible to different kinds of cancers based on the type of radiation environment that we predict. So that kind of ethical question, it's sort of anecdotal, but you may have heard that there's a debate about whether we should give people appendectomies, just in case, because that's a big problem that we'd have to face, and why not eliminate one more risk?
Yeah, and do we recruit people who all have the same blood type to go? And perfect teeth? And the appendectomy question is something we face for Antarctica as well, to answer the previous question. And the Australians do, I think, still require people to have their appendixes removed, which is interesting because after the age of 40, appendicitis really falls off. So what's the age of your astronauts? Really. So recruiting people based on their current physical condition to then send them into a vast unknown wilderness where the physical challenges are not entirely known is a bit of a gamble. You should probably send tech to deal with whatever you might come up with, rather than having to rely on the current state maintaining itself for 3 years.
We have a question here.
Hi, Justin Park, Intergalactic Education. This is more of a moral question too. Won't the first child being born in space be like a major step for humanity, and what's holding us back from doing that?
What's holding us back from doing that? It's a great question. I think that in theory, it would be an amazing step for humanity, and it would potentially be a point where we don't even know if a baby born in space, whether it's in microgravity or on the surface of a celestial body, we have no idea how they're going to develop. Will they develop bones the way that we do? Would they ever be capable of coming to Earth and actually standing up? So we're basically at that point talking about people who are going to be, if they exist in the future, are going to be vastly different from what we are. And that may be kind of a turning point in human history.
And I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm glad you brought it up. I want each of you to tell us what you think is an ethical consideration that needs to be made by NASA or SpaceX or whomever is going to have this first mission? What is something that you think is an ethical quandary or a question or consideration they should be thinking about and asking themselves? You want to start, Kris?
Sure. This is an exercise I go through with my graduate course. We talk about, Mike would have more intimate detail about this than I would, but what do you do if one of your crew members is sick or injured and you can't save them? At what point you're transiting to Mars, you're halfway there, someone becomes sick, you're trying to heal them and make them better, and you're using up all of your resources to do it. At what point do you stop taking care of that person and saving your resources because the mission comes first? And the concept there is it's called operational medicine. And the idea is that you have to have these discussions before you go. You have to think through these parameters and these scenarios, and you have to be prepared for them and realize that something terrible may happen, and you have to be able and willing to deal with it when it does arise.
Sheyna, what do you think?
That's a great question. I've actually been asked that question repeatedly, is when do you let people go and under what circumstances? And even if operational medicine states we're going to let somebody go because they're a crew person down, the person taking care of them is a crew person down, so now you're way down. What does that do to the crew psychologically? But my actual ethical question is, what information do you keep from a deep space crew? Do you tell them that their child is sick? Do you tell them that their mother has passed? Do you tell them that there's been an attack in their city? Or do you keep that information back because they have a really important DVA tomorrow and you want them focused? We started wondering that when the NEAS information came through, and I said, you know, if we'd had something to do first thing in the morning, that would have really been a hit on our performance. So what do we even want to know? And what do they decide that they can and can't tell us? And how do they decide that?
Mike, I'll let you have the last word on this.
So that's a real thing, and we deal with that now because we have that conversation. Each person, each crew member is asked that, you know, if there is news like that, do you want to know or do you not want to know? And it's obviously different for every person. My contribution to that conversation would be, and it's very real, so basically the consensus is that with today's propulsion and what it would take to get a vehicle to Mars anytime soon, the amount of radiation that a person would receive would exceed what NASA is okay with allowing somebody to do now. So we would have to, as a nation, have an ethical conversation about we are now going to change the standards. I think the consensus is that you almost certainly wouldn't get enough radiation to affect your performance on the mission, but you almost certainly would get enough radiation to affect your longevity to some degree. And there are metrics for that. And right now, the NASA administrative standard says that we can take a such and such % increase of risk over the normal mortality from cancer. That number would have to be a lot higher. And that is a conversation that has yet to happen, but is going to have to happen sometime soon.
Many more conversations to come. Unfortunately, my clock says 000, which means we're out of time. Please thank our panel and everyone who was involved today. It's a great day.